Welcome to where time falls quiet.
Were the pyramids rebuilt? Not built? The clue Egypt ignores. Take a moment to subscribe, so this place of calm is always here for you. What if everything we thought we knew about civilization was backwards? What if Egypt, the cradle of measured time and monumental stone, was not the beginning, but a faint echo of something far older? Imagine the sensation of sand shifting under your feet as you stand before the pyramids, realizing you are not looking at a triumph of beginnings, but at the residue of a memory, one restored, not created. This is where our story begins, not in confidence but in doubt, where the silence between stones begins to speak. Archaeology, as it is presented, is meant to be secure. Strata upon strata, a careful timeline built like bricks in a bureaucratic wall. Yet sometimes a fracture appears, a detail that does not belong to its assigned layer. Erosion that speaks of rain in lands where it has not fallen for thousands of years. Tool marks cut with a precision that should require instruments not yet invented. The system resists these fractures. It calls them anomalies, coincidences, errors. But the fractures multiply, and as they do, the narrative trembles. The pyramids are supposed to belong to the dynastic age, roughly 4.5 millennia ago. But listen closely to the stone. It remembers something different. Beneath the modern precision of carbon dating lies an older witness, geology itself. The body of the Sphinx, scarred by vertical channels carved not by desert wind, but by flowing water, whispers of a climate that last existed more than 10,000 years ago. The human mind resists that number. It feels like myth. Yet the sediment does not lie. Imagine you are an archaeologist kneeling in the Giza Plateau at dusk. You press your hand into the limestone wall, still faintly holding the ancient dampness of vanished rainfall. You are touching time itself, a geological palimpsest. What if this structure was already ancient when the first pharaohs were children? How would that change our notion of history? The question is not academic, it is existential. It asks, where does knowledge begin and, more alarmingly, where was it lost? Modern Egyptology was born in the 19th century, an era of measurement and imperial certainty. It built a tidy chronology stretching back to roughly 3 millennia before the Common Era, placing human achievement in an orderly line. But the more looked closer, through stratigraphy, astronomy, and linguistics, the more it found that the line dissolves. Out of the sands rise stories of floods, of sky-aligned monuments, of kings ruling for tens of thousands of years before the listed reigns of Menes or Nama. These were dismissed as myth, as clerical exaggeration, yet they persist, unwavering. The question that shouldn't be asked is simple. Could there have been pyramids before Egypt? The answer cannot be approached by belief alone. It must be examined through evidence, through the stubborn details that refuse to align with orthodox history. The erosion patterns, the astronomical alignments matching skies that existed long before recorded Egyptian dynasties, the repeating mathematical constants embedded in measurements as if the builders were not inventors, but restorers, following inherited blueprints. To consider this is to disrupt the comfort of our intellectual lineage. Civilization, we have been taught, is a straight line, hunter to farmer, farmer to builder, builder to thinker. But what if it is not a line at all? What if it is a tide, rising, collapsing, rising again, each crest erasing the memory of the last? The pyramids would then be not the seeds of our beginning, but the shells of our forgetting. The mind recoils because the implications are too large, that knowledge can vanish completely, and that perhaps we live upon the ruins of a forgotten. It is not only stone that bears witness. Languages do as well. Across early Egyptian myths, Mesopotamian clay tablets, and pre-dynastic carvings, one finds repeated references to rebuilding, never inventing, always restoring. Words like return and renew surface in religious contexts to describe the act of civilization itself, as if time were a wound being bandaged over and over. The hieroglyphs carved into the Inventory Stele speak plainly of a sanctuary that existed before the Pyramid of Khufu, a sanctuary built by gods who walked the land before the first dynasty began. The text is treated as pious fiction, but even fiction has fingerprints. Imagine standing before that same stele, its surface faintly polished by the millennia. The inscription lists inventories, mundane offerings, oil, linen, food. And yet, hidden amidst that bureaucratic precision, a single line extends time backwards thousands of years. The monument describes a house of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, already ancient in the days of Khufu. Why would a royal scribe embed such heresy into royal record-keeping? Unless perhaps he was copying from something much older. Every anomaly, when isolated, is deniable. But when anomalies accumulate, they become a pattern, and patterns have memory. Geological inconsistencies, linguistic slips, astronomical alignments, all begin to trace an outline in the dust. A ghost outline of something that came before, built as though anticipating rediscovery. The more one looks, the more impossible it becomes to say with certainty where invention ends and restoration begins. The past begins to feel like an echo chamber, our every achievement reverberating something older. The first time humanity looked up at the Orion Belt and traced its glittering geometry, it might not have been in Egypt at all. Long before dynasties etched names onto granite, someone already knew that those three stars formed a cosmic diagram mirrored upon the Earth. Giza's alignment, mathematically precise, parallels not the contemporary night sky of the fourth millennium before the Common Era, but a sky distorted by precessional drift, one visible more than 10,000 years earlier. That discrepancy written in the heavens refuses to vanish. The alignment is an accusation written in light. Of course, prefers silence where measurement is uncertain, yet silence itself is data. It hums in the gaps of history. The academic world calls these gaps dark ages, periods when knowledge disappears without explanation. But erosion does not produce dark ages. Catastrophe does. Civilizations vanish when the Earth convulses, when climate shifts, oceans rise, or heavens crack. Myths from across the globe describe the same sequence: flood, fire, rebirth. If multiple cultures carried that trauma, is it possible they are fragments of a single ancestral memory? The idea feels heretical because it reorders everything. Egypt no longer stands as the dawn of civilization, but as one in a series of restorations after each deluge of time. The flood myth becomes less theological, more geological, a record of sediment depth and abrupt climate change. Imagine if those who rebuilt Egypt were the descendants of survivors, carrying remnants of lost knowledge like embers rescued from an inferno. That image is neither mystical nor impossible. It is simply human. From Mesopotamia to the Andes, pyramids rise in impossible synchrony. Step, smooth or truncated, each one mathematically coherent, cosmologically aligned. Their builders, separated by oceans, used the same proportions, traced the same celestial patterns. Did coincidence instruct them? Or did memory travel, disguised as myth, across the generations until it was mistaken for divine revelation? The deeper we dig, the more this pattern haunts archaeology like a shadow without a source. If the architecture of Egypt was inherited knowledge, then the scribes of antiquity were archivists, not creators. That changes everything. It would mean that the grandeur of the ancient world was less a beginning than a preservation attempt, a desperate effort to reconstruct diagrams whose original purpose had been forgotten. To think this way is to recognize civilization itself as a form of amnesia management, a long chain of attempts to not forget what once mattered. Consider the phrase often repeated in sacred Egyptian texts, Zep Tepi, the first time. Scholars interpret it as mythology, the divine age when gods ruled before humanity. But what if it was not mystical language at all? What if it was literal, historical memory, a record of a vanished epoch when a different kind of civilization inhabited Earth, destroyed by event, remembered only as divinity by those who followed? The phrase then becomes a code, a linguistic fossil of prehistory, stating plainly there was a time before. To stare into that possibility is uncomfortable because it collapses hierarchy, the distance between us and them, between modernity and myth. It suggests that the line separating invention from memory is thinner than we wish to believe. Civilization would be revealed not as an ascent, but as a cycle of recovery and loss. This interpretation reframes progress itself as inheritance rediscovered. And in that new framework, the pyramids cease to be monuments to ancient kings. They become beacons of survival, precise signals left by those who refuse to let oblivion win completely. Every time a scholar brushes dust from a relic, there is a faint vibration, a whisper of continuity. The sand might shift, but the geometry remains. Beneath names and dynasties lies a substrate of knowledge, sexagesimal counting systems, precessional models, and trigonometric ratios, appearing fully mature with no childhood. That single fact alone unsettles orthodoxy. Every we rediscover already knew itself long before we could name it. And so the question remains, the question that shouldn't be asked but cannot be silenced. Did humanity really begin in Egypt? Or did Egypt begin where humanity ended once before? The stones, when they speak, do not tell tales of invention, they murmur of return. Their silence is ancient, but it is not empty. It holds weight, the weight of memory, the weight of accountability. As you watch the golden horizon burn over Giza, remember that silence is not absence, it is waiting, perhaps waiting for us to remember again. Time in stone is written without mercy. Every ripple of sediment, every mineral vein, every mark of erosion is a syllable in Earth's unending chronicle, indifferent to dynasties and names. The human story clings to these surfaces, trying to impose linear order on what is, in truth, a cyclical and recursive world. And when the layers do not fit the human timelines, the problem is not in the rock, it is in us. At Giza, the geological record contradicts the historical record with quiet defiance. The limestone that forms the body of the Sphinx carries erosional channels cut deep and wide, curved by the motion of liquid water coursing down its flanks. Such patterns cannot be made by wind. They require rainfall, prolonged, consistent, patient rainfall that would have ended in the Sahara more than 10,000 years before the first pharaoh rose to power. When specialists measured the depth of the grooves and the isotopic composition of the rock, the implications became unbearable. The surface of one of the world's most famous monuments predates Egypt itself. For the Orthodox scholar, this is an error, a misreading of E's handwriting. But for the geologist, the evidence is not rhetorical. It is stratigraphic. Water erosion cuts with a signature: rounded, smoothed, vertical. Wind erosion scours, horizontal, jagged. The Sphinx bears the former, not the latter. The sediment that collects along its enclosure wall confirms it. Layers deposited by standing water, not drifting sand. Something catastrophic shifted the climate after this monument was carved. The desert consumed what had once been a fertile plain. Imagine watching the last rain fall over the plateau that we now call Giza. Lakes withdraw, channels dry to silence. Air burns its way into stone where moss once grew. A civilization, or a fragment of one, abandons its works to the encroaching drought, leaving behind monuments too heavy to carry, too sacred to destroy. When centuries of sand finally bury them, they become invisible manuscripts, waiting for an era reckless enough to announce itself as the beginning. The earth has a way of storing memory in layers too subtle for everyday eyes. To read them is to enter a conversation with vast, silent time. Scientists study these layers the way philologists study lost languages. Each grain of quartz is a letter, each deposit a syntax of catastrophe and renewal. In the Giza Plateau, those strata whisper, not of Pharaoh Khafre and his builders, but of an earlier epoch when rain shaped the desert and humans perhaps walked under a cooler sun. The rock remembers what history forbids. The geological discord extends beyond Egypt. Across the Arabian Peninsula and into the Levant, signatures of abrupt climate transition appear in core samples, hinting at a sudden end to a humid, rain-fed era around 12,000 years ago. That date mirrors the supposed boundary between myth and record, the melting of the last ice age, the flood horizon where most ancient chronicles begin. The Sumerians called it the time before the waters rose. The Egyptians spoke of it as the end of the first time. In the sediment, both stories become the same. Historians often separate material evidence from myth, but geology refuses that division. Its vocabulary is absolute: flood, deposition, uplift, fracture. It is the most bureaucratic of sciences and yet, paradoxically, the most poetic, because each measurement is a confession that the earth itself keeps secrets. The Sphinx is one such confession carved in plain sight. When its shoulder stones were tested, the difference in weathering between its upper and lower strata revealed a stark anomaly. The lower portions had endured centuries of water flow before the upper layers existed. The monument we associate with Khafre might merely have been recarved, not built under his rule. The thought reorients everything. Egypt's great monuments might not signify invention, but renovation, a repair effort after catastrophe. In that case, ancient architects were not innovators at all. They were archaeologists themselves, attempting to preserve fragments of a memory already eroding. The limestone of Giza becomes a conversation across epochs, between builders separated by thousands of years, but united in purpose, to resist oblivion. Consider how human hands can smooth stone, but only time can round it perfectly. The surface of the Sphinx enclosure, when examined under oblique light, reveals undulating patterns that resemble the inside of seashells, curves formed not by tools but by water. That elegance of erosion is unforgeable. It speaks of natural forces far larger than human ambition. It also speaks of duration, of rainfall so consistent over so long a time that even granite would soften. Such tenderness between water and stone cannot be reconciled with pharaonic timelines. Either the monument is far older than we think, or the desert once reigned for impossibly long after recorded history began. Some resist the geological evidence because it demands an unacceptable history, one in which civilization is older than its record, and in which catastrophe is not metaphor, but memory. Catastrophism fell out of favor in the 20th century because it frightened progress. To admit that the Earth periodically resets itself, wiping away knowledge and structure, is to admit that our continuity is an illusion. Yet the strata say, what we will not. The floods return, ash follows rain, and from that sediment, new stones are shaped. Imagine being that first geologist to trace the erosion lines with your fingertips. You can feel the grooves deepen under the pads of your fingers, each channel a count of vanished centuries. You sense the rhythm of ancient storms, and as the wind brushes the sand across your boots, you know it will erase your own footprints within minutes, just as it erased those who carved before you. In that moment, you realize geology is not alone. It is empathy with time. Elsewhere on the plateau, the same contradiction arises. The pyramids, though younger on the surface, rest atop bedrock formations whose erosion patterns tell of ages before recorded Egypt. Some foundation stones contain fossils only exposed during earlier epochs of sedimentation. If the builders quarried locally, as many theories suggest, the stone they took was already ancient before their civilization's birth. Thus, the monument itself is a mosaic of eras, ancient material assembled into a slightly less ancient form. This layered reality blurs the boundary between history and geology until the two become inseparable. The more one studies these strata, the more human time collapses into geological time. Civilization's entire duration fits neatly into a thin line of deposits, thinner than a single sheet in a core sample. The entire written record of humanity would measure less than the width of one of those erosional grooves. And yet, we call ourselves old. In that perspective, the pyramids become less a miracle and more a symptom. They are what happens when a species begins to fear forgetting, when memory feels geological, not biological. The builders carved their knowledge into stone because stone alone seemed immune to the churn of ages. But even stone lies. It absorbs rain, pressure, silence, and transforms. The irony is inescapable. The medium of permanence becomes the record of its own erosion. When comparative studies of rock weathering at other sites were conducted, the temples of Abydos, the Osirian at the valley's edge, the same pattern emerged: inexplicable waterwear in structures supposedly built under desert sky. The Osirian, sunk deep below ground level, displays smooth, concave scour marks across its granite pillars. There, water once pooled deep enough to rise above a man's knees. Its architects did not fear moisture, they expected it. How could they have, unless they remembered a time when Egypt was green? Satellite imagery of subterranean aquifers below the Sahara reveals the ghost of that time. Beneath dunes lie networks of dry riverbeds, delta formations, and ancient shorelines stretching across what is now wasteland. These geological scars do not belong to the pharaonic period. They belong to a world of lakes and rainfall that ended long before civilized written language began. If people lived through that transition, they would have watched paradise turn to dust. The monuments they raised might have been less celebration, more memorial. In every age, humanity believes it lives at the summit of progress. The Egyptians thought the same, unaware they might have been inheriting rather than inaugurating civilization. That illusion continues, modern, with all its instruments, remains reluctant to see its own patterns in those ancient anxieties. Yet geology forces humility. Its testimony is too quiet, too patient to manipulate. It reminds us that certainty itself erodes. Stand now in your mind before the great Sphinx. The light of late afternoon carves shadow into its contours. What you see as cracks are, in truth, wrinkles of time. Each fissure runs deeper than any inscription, older than any name. Beneath your feet lie the invisible years, centuries compressed into inches of rock. And beneath that, perhaps, the bones of an unknown civilization that once knew the meaning of those rains. When you breathe and taste iron in the air, it is the taste of ancient water returning after a silence of millennia. The geological discord is not an inconvenience. It is the very hinge of history. Without it, the human story would remain linear, comfortable, small. With it, we must confront the abyss of recurrence, the terrifying possibility that the Earth keeps resetting the clock, and that our monuments are simply the punctuation of those resets. The Sphinx becomes less a guardian, more a witness, a creature carved by one epoch, adopted by another, misread by both. The discomfort is not merely scientific, it is personal. To acknowledge the geological discord is to accept that even memory is sedimentary, that we build our truths atop layers of earlier forgetting. The Earth does not urge us to despair, it urges us to remember deeper. Because in the long stillness between strata, time listens. And perhaps, if we listen back, we might hear not just the story of Egyptians and kings, but our own reflection in the patient sorrow of stone. There are documents that survive not because they were meant to, but because time forgot to burn them. The Inventory Stele is one of them, an unassuming limestone slab discovered near the Temple of Isis on the Giza Plateau. Its surface cracked, its hieroglyphs faint, like a whisper under centuries of dust. To the casual observer, it reads as little more than a royal inventory, a bureaucratic listing of offerings. But hidden within its methodical script is a sentence that rearranges the very chronology of Egypt itself. The Stele names a place called the House of Isis, the mistress of the pyramid, and claims that this temple existed long before the reign of Khufu. It goes further, suggesting that the Great Pyramid itself was repaired during his rule, not built. For the conventional chronology, this is heresy. If true, it would mean that the center of Egyptian achievement, the perfectly aligned pyramid of Khufu, stands not as an innovation of the Old Kingdom, but as a restoration of something incomparably older. When the Stele was first studied, scholars treated that line as pious exaggeration, an attempt to link the pharaoh to divine antiquity. But the tone of the text is bureaucratic, almost clinical. It lists objects, locations, quantities, as if it were documenting temple stocks. Its mixture of sacred and mundane would be strange for myth, but natural for preservation. The more one reads, the more it stops feeling like mythology and begins to sound like record-keeping. An inventory not of offerings but of memory itself. Imagine holding the Stele under the light of a fading afternoon, tracing the carved signs with your fingertips. The words name goddesses, shrines, and objects long vanished. Statues worn to shapeless stone. Bowls whose copper long since flaked away. Yet, among the expected, one phrase stands apart. The temple existed in the time of the followers of Horus. That phrase drags the narrative backward to a time before dynasties when, according to the ancient king lists, gods and demigods ruled for thousands of years. Mainstream archaeology dismisses that as an allegory for tribal ancestors. But what if it wasn't? The existence of pre-dynastic rulers known as the Shemzu Hor the followers of Horus, is repeated in multiple sources: the Turin Papyrus, the Palermo stone, and several early inscriptions. Their reigns are recorded in decades counted in tens of thousands of years, numbers so vast they are impossible as human lifespans, unless those numbers did not measure years, but cycles or processes. The Inventory Stele, by casually placing the pyramid in their era, merges the mythic with the physical. The impossible becomes stratigraphic fact. It is here that archaeology collides with theology. Egypt's early texts often mask technical events in divine language. Words like "the gods built" or "Ra gave instruction to the masons" sound mystical until one recognizes they might preserve descriptions of people remembered as divine because their skills belong to another age. If civilization is cyclical, then the earliest Egyptians would have encountered ruins from a prior civilization so advanced they could only interpret them as the works of gods. The stele may be their bureaucratic acknowledgement of that encounter. The inventory does not just mention the house of Isis. It lists repairs undertaken by Khufu, suggesting a caretaker role rather than that of creator. The hieroglyphs use the verb restore, a term subtly different from build. The word evokes renewal, continuity, memory. The image of the pharaoh transforms, not a triumphant founder, but a meticulous conservator scavenging fragments from the wreckage of prehistory. His stoneworkers realigned, repaved, re-inherited. Within the stele's context, even the goddess Isis takes on another dimension. In later tradition, she is the mother of resurrection, restorer of Osiris, the magician who reassembles what has been torn apart. Her presence beside the pyramid as mistress is symbolic perfection. What if the mythic role of Isis, reconstruction after dismemberment, was a theological metaphor for the civilization itself rebuilding from the ruins of an older world? The temple's devotion becomes allegory for memory, Egypt's memory of the first time. The power of the inventory. Stele lies not in its claims but in its tone. It does not cry for belief. It calmly describes. It does not mythologize. It catalogues. A simple surface inventory quietly rewires time, insisting that something monumental stood before Khufu, that the pyramid was not the beginning but the most recent iteration. Scholars uncomfortable with that implication have attempted to dismiss the tablet as a later forgery. Yet the weathering on its surface, the patina of centuries, contradicts the simplicity of that denial. Fakes do not erode in silence for millennia. Imagine the moment the scribes pressed the wet pigment into those hieroglyphs, never suspecting that their notation would outlive empires, religions, and languages. They were not writing for legend, they were writing for inventory. But time reinterprets everything. Their list, once as mundane as an accounting sheet, becomes the most dangerous chronicle of all, a document that refuses to fit within accepted time. Because time itself, it seems, was once measured differently. The stele's mere existence opens the door to something far greater than academic discomfort. It reveals a pattern in ancient Egypt's relationship with antiquity. Everywhere one looks, the oldest monuments show evidence of reuse, reinscription, and retroactive dedication. The temple at Abydos, claimed by Seti I, preserves walls bearing much earlier construction techniques. The Osirian, sunk deep into the bedrock, appears architecturally older than the complex built around it. Just as the stele suggests, many new temples stand upon ancient foundations. Egypt did not erase its predecessors, it built directly atop them. Archaeology calls this layering, continuity of cult, but in linguistic terms it is a palimpsest, a document written over and over, where traces of the original text remain. The Inventory Stele might be one of the few surviving translations of that deeper layer, a page accidentally turned open onto history's rough draft. And like all drafts, it reveals uncertainty, overlap, and the residue of lost thought. Those residues haunt the entire civilization. Scholars sometimes say that Egypt was obsessed with eternity, but perhaps it was the opposite. Perhaps it was haunted by impermanence. To believe your monuments will last forever is to fear forgetting. To carve stone with such precision is to declare war against erosion, against loss. The bureaucratic devotion behind the Inventory Stele can be read as an act of desperation, an empire recording not what it possessed, but what it remembered it had once possessed. Consider for a moment the tone of Egyptian inscriptions. Even in their most divine pronouncements, there is an undercurrent of accounting, names, titles, measurements, dates. As if the divine was a matter of administration. It is the same voice you find in the Inventory Stele, cold and efficient, yet carrying infinite melancholy. Because within those enumerations hides the awareness that memory itself is disappearing. The scribes were not chronicling glory. They were saving fragments from the collapse of clarity. In this way, the Inventory Stele stands not only as an archaeological anomaly, but as an emotional one. It marks the point where Egypt looks backward at something larger than itself. You can feel the tension in every translated word: reverence, confusion, awe. The stele does not exalt Khufu. It humbles him. It records him encountering ruins beyond his comprehension. And that is why the object disturbs historians. It portrays a pharaoh not as the god-king of origin, but as the mortal inheritor of fragments. The forbidden names that appear alongside Isis in the stele's text complete the heresy. They include references to divine builders, not part of the later pantheon, names that do not appear in regular temple lists. Their inclusion reads like a list of ancestors erased by later theology. The implication is clear. The priests of Isis kept a record of those who built before, those whose memory had become dangerous. The text, therefore, is not simply inventory. It is resistance literature disguised as ritual accountancy. If you pause and listen carefully to such artifacts, a pattern emerges. The so-called mythic time and the so-called historical time become inseparable. The stone language no longer divides miracle from method. It describes a continuum where each era is a restoration of the last. The inventory. Stele is a bureaucratic scar, administration preserving what theology dared not proclaim. The fact that it survived at all feels accidental, as if history itself wished to preserve one clue for those who still listened. Imagine finding yourself alone in the Cairo Museum late at night, the hall lit only by the diffuse glow of street lamps. You stand before the stele's cracked surface, unable to read the glyphs, but sensing a presence within them, not mystical, but archival. It is as though an ancient clerk whispers through the stone, "We were not first." The message bypasses language. It enters directly into the unease of modernity, where progress feels fragile and memory conditional. Egypt's real miracle was not its architecture, but its refusal to forget completely. The archive, in all its forms, outlived its empires. The Inventory Stele is one sheet from that archive, recovered and misunderstood. Its forbidden names are the names of those whom history erased twice, once by catastrophe and once by consensus. Yet there they remain, carved meticulously, waiting for the day the silence would grow heavy enough to be heard again. This is how evidence hides, in the open, wrapped in ordinary words, pretending to be unimportant. The Inventory Stele is a reminder that bureaucracy can become rebellion, that even an inventory list can rewrite the human timeline. Whispering under its surface is a declaration too audacious for its age. We were remembering, not inventing. In that sentence lies the heart of the mystery. Egypt was not the tomb of beginnings, it was the library of what survived. There are civilizations whose mathematics grow like trees, gradually, from counting stones to geometry, from geometry to symbols. Then there are those that appear fully formed, like architecture from the sand. When scholars began translating Sumerian and Egyptian mathematical texts, they expected childish equations, primitive fractions, tentative measures. What they found instead were systems of terrifying precision, already mature, already mastered, as though human curiosity did not invent mathematics, but inherited it. The oldest surviving mathematical documents written in wet clay by Sumerian scribes describe right triangles, reciprocals, and base 60 structure. Those tablets do not show hesitation. They show familiarity, routine, almost boredom. Their numbers are not experimental but administrative, applied to celestial motion and temple planning. The scribe who wrote them was not discovering, he was remembering. His formulas were the echoes of a code handed down, repeated, and mechanized through centuries of ritual record-keeping. The same sudden maturity occurs in Egypt. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, surveyors already operated with systems so advanced they could calculate the curvature of ramps used to haul hundreds of tons of stone. The architecture of the pyramids, particularly the alignment of Giza, encodes ratios that match those of celestial cycles, ratios only rediscovered millennia later when trigonometry was formalized. What does it mean when knowledge predates its supposed discovery? It means the timeline is inverted, that the roots of wisdom lie deeper than the official tree. Imagine standing with a surveyor on the plateau at dawn, a cord stretched taut across the ground, the plumb bob swinging gently in the dry air. He measures the horizon through an alignment of stars, using rhythms rather than instruments, listening rather than calculating. Every movement of his arm preserves a geometric heritage older than kingship. He is not measuring for himself. He is maintaining continuity, translating memory into structure. Mathematics is supposed to have a childhood, an infancy of counting pebbles before abstraction begins. But in these ancient sources, that infancy is missing. From the earliest accounts we have of Egyptian and Mesopotamian law, mathematics appears as the language of bureaucracy and heaven simultaneously. There is no prelude of experimentation. There are only tables, constants, and the quiet arrogance of a system that has already forgotten its origin story. One of the most striking aspects of ancient mathematics is not its complexity, but its consistency. Across continents in cultures with no recorded contact, the same geometric ratios arise. The ratio of circumference to diameter, the measure we now call pi, emerges from stone circles in Britain, from step pyramids in Mesoamerica, from hieroglyphic papyri in Egypt. It is as though humanity learned the same message in different languages from a single, vanished teacher. Something universal, yet not evolutionary, whispers through these shared proportions. Egypt's obsession with proportion was not aesthetic alone. It was cosmological. Temples mirrored constellations, chamber measurements encoded harmonic intervals. Numbers were symbols of eternal principles, bridges between heaven and earth. The number 7 invoked divine completion. The ratio 3 to 4 to 5 generated harmony, the sacred right triangle known centuries later as Pythagorean, though it was already ancient by then. Civilization, it seems, did not rise into geometry, it awoke inside it, as if rediscovering an element of rather than inventing it. The so-called Pythagorean triple, immortalized in Greek tradition, lives already in the sand of Sumer and the papyri of Egypt. Those who later rediscovered it did not expand knowledge, they excavated it, and that inversion redefines the concept of progress. To progress would then mean to recover what has been lost, to translate ancient clarity into new dialects. Mathematics becomes archaeology, a digging in the sediments of the mind. The Babylonian clay tablet, often called Plimpton 322, lists rows of numbers that adhere perfectly to trigonometric relationships. Yet its makers left no commentary, no grand explanation. To them, triangles were as ordinary as ledgers. In Egypt, architects inscribed proportional tables for construction of pyramids with precise inclinations that yield harmonic resonances when translated into frequency. The builders measured not random numbers, but whole number ratios that mirrored the octave relationships in sound. Geometry, music, and cosmology were not separate fields. They were the same discipline written in stone. When you trace these proportions through the pyramids, a quiet intelligence reveals itself. The Great Pyramid's height-to-base ratio encodes the value of pi, while its inner chambers align with solar and stellar cycles, marking solstices and precessional transitions with uncanny accuracy. Such precision is inconceivable without advanced observation tools, yet none have been found. Either the tools were perishable or symbolic, or the builders worked from pre-existing plans whose origin had already been forgotten. The result is not experiment, but transcription. To imagine ancient humanity as primitive is a modern arrogance. Every calculation, every alignment, every carved grid shows an understanding integrated into daily survival. The world to them was not measured but sung, not divided but resonant. Their measurements mirrored music because they believed the universe itself was built in intervals. The line between surveyor and priest disappears. Each number is an act of devotion. Mathematics was the sacred syntax through which they preserved contact with what came before. Modern calls this syncretism superstition because it blurs empirical from spiritual. But the ancients saw no such boundary. Their numbers breathed, their geometry lived. To divide architecture from astronomy was to amputate meaning. In that seamless universe, a pyramid was both a clock and a hymn, both an equation and an offering. Every angle was theology, every integer a relic of sound. Imagine again the ancient scribe, head bowed over clay, incising symbols with a reed stylus. The wedge marks arranged in perfect columns seem mechanical, but beneath their precision vibrates awe. He was not inventing trigonometry, he was translating rhythm into matter. The act itself was devotional. To record numerical harmony was to affirm that the cosmos still remembered its order. The mystery deepens when one examines the continuity of the sexagesimal system, the base 60 arithmetic that governs both Babylonian and modern timekeeping. Its endurance is unnatural. Number bases evolve, yet base 60 persists unbroken, woven into seconds, minutes, and circles. No clear origin, no mathematical necessity can account for that persistence. It survives not through innovation, but inheritance, carried like genetic memory from the world before history learned to write. The ghost of an older civilization hides in every clock tick. This idea that mathematics was received rather than discovered unsettles the modern narrative of progress. It suggests that knowledge is not cumulative but recursive. that humanity rediscovers fragments of an original template each time it rebuilds. The myth of the lost first time, that golden epoch remembered in Egyptian lore, then transforms into a statement of pattern recognition. The first time is every time knowledge reawakens after catastrophe. The equations on ancient clay are the fossils of that moment of remembrance. Even the zero, often attributed to much later innovation, lurks implicitly in older calculations. The Sumerians used spacing to denote absence. The Egyptians left deliberate gaps in their hieratic number lines, acknowledging the void as operative. Nothingness itself was a measurable value, absence given structure. To define zero is to confront mortality, to name the space between existence and memory. Their silent placeholders speak more profoundly than any theorem. If mathematics truly appeared fully mature, we must ask, who matured it? Either human minds, scattered by catastrophe, retained ancestral fragments of an advanced system, or civilization itself is cyclical, governed by long intervals of amnesia and recall. The evidence written in geometry weighs toward the latter. Each time humanity rebuilds, the same constants emerge, the same planetary ratios, the same astronomical harmonies, as if guided by instinct more than intellect. Perhaps these constants are not invention, but inheritance coded into cognition itself. In sacred texts, numbers often carry personified meaning. The Ennead of Egypt, the Ogdoad of Hermopolis, the sacred triads of Sumer. These groupings mirror numerical hierarchies that extend into structure, angle, and sound. To call them mythic is merely to misunderstand the language of data in its infancy. They were not naive imaginings, but abstractions by which the ancients conceptually mapped the world. Mathematics was not a discipline, it was the memory of creation itself. When antiquity ends, mathematics begins to specialize and forget its origin as revelation. The Greeks inherit fragments, refining their geometry but severing its ritual pulse. By the time of Euclid, the number has lost its voice and become written law, an artifact of what once sang. The modern age inherits that amnesia, mistaking order for progress. But beneath every theorem lies a pulse, an ancestral heartbeat waiting to be remembered. Look again at the pyramids. Their lines do not reach for heaven arbitrarily. They reproduce precise angular dependencies corresponding to Earth's polar tilt and orbital duration. Within that architecture hides time itself, encoded not as story, but proportion. The pyramid becomes a calendar petrified, an equation resolved into limestone. And every successive civilization that measures the stars finds those same numbers already waiting, patient as the dawn. If knowledge can be inherited across extinctions, then we must accept that forgetting is not failure, but design. Each cycle of civilization buries then rediscovers mathematics, as though time trains consciousness by amputation. The ancients did not create knowledge anew. They reassembled it from shards, recomposed its melody by ear from faint remaining echoes. The mathematics of Sumer, of Egypt, of forgotten builders before them, are notes from the same lost composition played again across the ages. So here, under the star-laden silence, every measure becomes liturgy, every number remembrance. The equations of the ancients do not describe, they mourn. Their accuracy was not pride but reverence, a refusal to let the old world vanish completely. Mathematics without a childhood is not a mystery to be solved. It is a confession left behind by a species trying desperately to remember how to count the stars before it forgot their names. Long before astronomy became AE, it was an act of memory. The sky was a scripture written in movement, and the ancients read it as archivists of eternity, They did not merely map stars, they preserved chronology through alignment, translating celestial geometry into stone. Every monument that reaches for the heavens is both an observation and an obituary, for skies that no longer exist exactly as they did when the stones were placed. The Giza Plateau, when read astronomically, reveals a code that refuses coincidence. The pyramids of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure align not simply along the Nile, but with the three stars of Orion's belt. Yet the match is not perfect in our current sky. To fit precisely, one must turn the celestial clock backward by many thousands of years, to an era when Orion rose lower on the horizon. That date, mathematically calculated, falls near 10,500 years before the Common Era, a time traditionally dismissed as pre-civilizational. And still, the correlation remains unbroken. To look at those alignments is to realize that the builders of Giza were not merely architects. They were astronomers skilled enough to track the slow wobble of Earth's axis over millennia. That wobble, the process we call precession, shifts the position of stars gradually over 26,000 years. It is not a phenomenon visible in one lifetime. Recognition of it requires records, continuity, and patience extending beyond dynasties. Whoever first mapped those stars possessed not only intellect, but inheritance. Knowledge passed through catastrophes as method, not myth. Imagine a priest astronomer standing on Giza's sand under an ancient sky. His eyes follow Orion rising, each star pulsing through a thin veil of atmosphere. He is not worshipping, he is measuring. The horizon is his instrument, the temple his notebook. He must know that time moves both forward and in circles. Perhaps he feels that the stars themselves are speaking, whispering coordinates left from an elder epoch. Across civilizations, the same constellation reverberates. The constellation we moderns call Orion appears again and again, from the three pyramids of Giza to the three colossal mounds of Teotihuacan to the aligned earthworks of ancient China. Cultures separated by oceans and ages converged on the same stellar design. The pattern cannot be coincidence at such scale. It suggests a cosmological inheritance, a shared understanding encoded into humanity's architectural DNA. In every instance, these alignments chart memory, each pyramid a node in a geolithic network of remembrance. When the night sky shifted, myths emerged to explain it. The Egyptians called the belt stars the souls of Osiris, and his resurrection each year mirrored Orion's heliacal rising. In the processional cycle, they saw theology in rotation, birth, decline, and rebirth as literal arms of the cosmos. The pyramid texts describe that journey not as metaphor but as navigation. To die was to travel along a celestial map drawn by ancestors, returning through stargates to the source of light. Astronomy for them was theology as logistics. The mastery implied by these correlations extends beyond observation. The shafts within the Great Pyramid, perfectly straight through hundreds of feet of stone, point precisely towards stars that marked rituals of death and renewal some 12,000 years ago. The southern shaft aligns with Alnitak, part of Orion's belt, while the northern passes toward Thuban in the constellation of Draco, once the pole star, long before Polaris assumed that title. The builders encoded the heavens in stone as if fearing the sky itself might someday vanish. The same understanding echoes at Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert. Stone circles erected millennia before the pyramids, calibrated to track solstice sunrises and the heliacal rising of Sirius. Their creators knew the length of Earth's year, with a precision rivaling later civilizations by several thousand years. And when the local climate collapsed, they buried their stones deliberately, shielding the pattern beneath dunes, as if aware that those who came later would need reminders of a forgotten sky. When scholars first recognized these prehistoric observatories, they struggled to explain how hunter societies, lacking agriculture, could construct instruments of such fidelity. The answer may be that they did not invent astronomy, they salvaged it. After a global disruption, perhaps a climatic event at the end of the Ice Age, remnants of a sophisticated people carried forward fragments of celestial knowledge, reconstructing the sky the way refugees rebuild language. Their architecture was less innovation than restoration across extinction. The precision of the Giza complex is mirrored across continents, a symmetry that defies diffusionist explanation. At Teotihuacan, the pyramids of the sun and moon align with the same celestial grid as Giza, their avenues tilted deliberately to mark the same axial relationships. The builders understood precession, geometry, and cosmology in unison. They were not isolated savants. They were members of an unacknowledged scientific lineage that spanned epochs. The stars, constant and indifferent, served as the bridge. Every alignment implies a question of memory. To maintain synchronization with the heavens requires long-term observation across centuries, uninterrupted by catastrophe or corruption. Yet history is nothing but interruption. How, then, did such coherence survive? Perhaps the answer lies not in institutional continuity, but in the very structure of human consciousness, an archetypal memory of the sky, encoded in myths so persistent they outlast ice, flood, and empire. Consider the myth of the flood, mirrored in Sumer, Egypt, and Mesoamerica. The waters rise, the stars disappear, the survivors emerge beneath a changed firmament. In each story, the survivors rebuild by orienting themselves not to land, but to the heavens. The act of realignment is both trauma and recovery. Their astronomies, then, were acts of remembrance through geometry, cognitive therapy on a cosmic scale. To gaze upward is, at heart, to measure loss. The ancient astronomers measured what no monument could preserve: motion, drift, deviation. The sky changes slowly enough to deceive the impatient, but swiftly enough to remind us that even stars die. When the ancient world mapped these movements, it was not curiosity, but defiance. Their stone observatories whispered a single warning: remember or vanish. Modern academia often reduces these alignments to convenience. The pyramids pointed where foundation stability demanded, the orientations mere accident. But accident does not produce alignment with precessional accuracy. Accident does not explain the mirrored angles between distant continents. The denial is psychological, not evidential. The thought that the past may have known more than we do now breaks the self-image of progress. We call evidence coincidence to preserve chronology. There is a haunting in the numbers, the axial tilt of the Earth, the precessional rate of 1 degree every 72 years, the recurrence of that number in mythic cycles of gods and kings. 72 conspirators kill Osiris. 72 stones encircle certain temples. 72-fold time divisions govern ancient calendars. These repetitions are linguistic fossils, traces of a numerical astronomy coded in parable and rite. We recite myths without knowing we are repeating equations. Imagine if knowledge survived not in archives but in rituals, each dance around a fire preserving constants of time and orbit. The ancients may have transmitted astronomy as story because story is indestructible. Even in collapse, a tale can move through generations when tools cannot. Every myth containing numbers, alignments, and heavens may secretly encode instruction manuals for resynchronization. Those who built after the flood did not start anew. They decoded what their ancestors encrypted in song. The astronomers of the vanished sky regarded the stars not as distant objects, but as coordinates for metaphysics. The cosmos was a mirror in constant motion, a blueprint of recurrence. They saw in the cycles of Venus, Jupiter, and Sirius the same rhythm that governed human epochs, the rise and fall of civilizations as predictable as orbits. Time itself was a recurrence, history a celestial echo. To measure the sky was to measure fate. Among the earliest Egyptian glyphs for the word order appears the image of a plumb line suspended between heaven and earth. Ma'at, the goddess embodying cosmic balance, carried that symbol. To her priests, the order of stars was ethical truth, a moral geometry. When procession shifted the heavens, they saw chaos, the cosmic injustice of forgetting alignment. To restore the temples was to restore the world's conscience. Astronomy thus became not but responsibility. If the alignments across Earth map a single forgotten design, then our entire planet may be a palimpsest of one civilization's final project, to encode knowledge through architecture durable enough to outlast cataclysm. The distribution of monuments along key latitudes and meridians, the repetition of sacred numbers like 3, 4, and 12 suggest deliberate planning. Perhaps anticipating erasure, they carved a message across continents. A message designed to be rediscovered when humanity regained its memory of the stars. Close your eyes and picture the night sky as it appeared 12 millennia ago. The Milky Way stretches brighter than now, unpolluted by cities, a luminous river mirrored by the Nile. The constellations looked different, their rising points shifted, their myths unborn. Somewhere beneath that vault, an ancestor marks their positions with small stones, aligning them to mountains, rivers, and future ruins. Their hope is simple: that someone, someday, will look up again and recognize the pattern. The question that lingers is no longer whether ancient peoples observed the stars, but how they learned to remember across destruction. The astronomers of the vanished sky did not discover, they restored. Each alignment, each temple, each myth is a coordinate in a map that points backward, beyond history's visible shore. And if the map is accurate, then the heavens themselves are archives, preserving humanity's oldest conversation with itself, written in light that has only just reached us. There are myths that sound like memory disguised as reverence. In the chronicles of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Andes, gods do not merely descend to rule, they arrive to rebuild, bringing the arts of stone, language, and order to a traumatized earth. They are not creators ex nihilo, but restorers of knowledge lost to cataclysm. And their attributes, though veiled in theology, resemble the detail of technicians, engineers, and astronomers more than the whims of deities. The oldest Sumerian records recount that civilization was gifted, not developed. Their first kings were taught by the Anunna, beings described as those of royal seed, who measured, divided, and instructed. The earliest city of Eridu was said to have been founded under their supervision, complete with blueprints etched into clay. Egypt, too, remembers the gods as builders: Thoth, the measurer of time, and Ptah, the architect who spoke worlds into geometry. Their pantheons overlap in suspiciously similar skill sets: surveyors, metallurgists, and scientists of balance. To call them gods is to translate from the language of trauma. What if these great teachers were survivors, not divinities, remnants of a technological epoch shattered by the same deluge that eroded the Sphinx? To later generations, their knowledge would have appeared supernatural. A handful of engineers emerging among farmers would seem divine indeed, their tools incomprehensible, their language sacred. Over generations, their memory calcified into myth. Imagine a fragmented civilization emerging from disaster, oceans receding, fertile plains carved anew, survivors wandering among the bones of cities washed clean. What do they remember of metallurgy, of mathematics, of architecture? Very little. And into that vacuum arrive the gods, not from the heavens, but from the margins of memory, carrying instruments whose function now appears magical. Their purpose is simple: to restore continuity, to teach construction, irrigation, calculation, to resume the interrupted dialogue between humanity and the cosmos. Every ancient language encodes this theme of descent. The Egyptians preserved it in the myth of the first time, when divine beings rebuilt temples ruined by flood. The Sumerians speak of the appointment of culture bringers after the black storm swept over the earth. The pre-Columbian legends of Viracocha and Quetzalcoatl repeat it. Pale figures arriving from the sea, teaching the balance of measurement and compassion, then vanishing without death. These narratives are not unique. They are parallel recollections of an intervention in history that the survivors themselves could not contextualize. The of the gods as engineers arises from their methods. They are described not as omnipotent, but as precise. Thoth counts. Enki divides. Viracocha draws. Each is a mathematician cloaked in metaphor. Even in myth, they are builders constrained by rules, governed by laws of proportion and rhythm. They do not conjure mountains, they survey them. They do not dream the city, they lay its foundation with measured chords, the same way Giza's architects did, the same way the ziggurats were raised from mud brick to mimic heaven's stair. Their miracles sound eerily like technology disguised as wonder. Fire that cuts stone, rods that speak, ships that traverse the sky or water without oar or sail. Legends filtered through centuries of misunderstanding. These motifs recur across every continent. Either coincidence speaks through the entire species, or survival has a single ancestral source. Ancient scribes, lacking vocabulary for mechanism, translated innovation as divinity. Their reverence was not for gods, but for competence. The word netta, which the Egyptians used for deity, might be better understood as principle or function. A neta was not a person, but a power, a role, an aspect of law personified. When Thoth measures or Ptah conceives, they illustrate intellectual categories clothed in myth. To walk among them, as the texts describe, is to participate in the restoration of cosmic order. The gods walked not as ethereal visions, but as laws in motion, wearing human faces so that cognition could recognize them. In humanity's early dawn, knowledge itself required translation into myth in order to survive. After the catastrophe, when the survivors could no longer build monuments of thought, they built monuments of story. Each god became a mnemonic device, compressing a field of lost expertise into personality. Thoth preserved astronomy. Isis preserved resurrection, the art of reassembly. Ptah embodied engineering, creation through articulation. Their temples, like memory palaces, stored the discipline of recovery behind theological veils. Archaeological remnants support a strangely technological sophistication at odds with presumed antiquity. In the ruins of ancient quarries around Aswan, stone blocks show cut marks resembling machine scoring. The precision of the Great Pyramid's granite casing, fitted within fractions of an inch across acres of surface, defies explanation through copper tools. The alignment to true north, accurate beyond the capabilities of mere sight, suggests either advanced surveying or a legacy instrument now lost. The gods, it seems, walked with levels and compasses rather than thunderbolts. To attribute such works to superstition is easy. To explain their geometry without instruments is impossible. The silence of mainstream history on this tension is palpable. It treats anomalies as curiosities rather than symptoms, because the alternative, acknowledging a pre-existing technological tradition, shatters the linear model of human development. But the evidence of engineering remains, etched into every immovable block. Machines of myth leave measurable fingerprints. Imagine the priests of Memphis teaching initiates before colossal reliefs of tar, speaking softly of proportion and resonance. To shape a temple was, for them, a matter of harmonics. Stones sang when aligned correctly, and walls were tuned to frequencies that amplified human voice. Within the sanctuaries, words carried weight beyond their meaning. They became vibration. Perhaps this is the truth behind the creative word of Thoth, who builds through utterance. Sound as structure, voice as vector, language as technology remembered through ritual. Across oceans, echoes repeat. The mythic teacher Quetzalcoatl carries a symbol, serpent intertwined with bird, matter merged with mathematics. He departs with the promise to return when the stars realign, a memory of cycles, of recurrence after loss. In Mesopotamia, Ea rises from the waters to distribute the Me, sacred tablets encoding arts and sciences. These are not commandments, they are curricula. The gods walk, teach, vanish. Humanity advances, forgets, and writes hymns to fill the empty horizon where instructions once existed. Every civilization venerates a teacher whose tools appear divine, whose departure marks the silence before decline. That pattern repeats with mechanical certainty. After each collapse, the inheritors build not to innovate, but to reconstruct from fragments. The mantra of the ancients, as above, so below, is nothing less than an engineering principle encoded in theology. Structural symmetry as memory, architecture as prayer. The gods do not demand worship, they demand comprehension. The dual identity of these beings, half divine, half artisanal, blurs mythology into anthropology. The Egyptian pharaohs called themselves sons of Ra, but their rituals were manuals of mathematics disguised as devotion. They oriented temples with astrolabes, simulated stellar motion with tilted ceilings, and embedded fractional geometry into stone relief. Each rite became an operation of calibration, maintaining harmony between heaven's machinery and earth's architecture. The gods' descent represented the transmission of that operational. Even the myths of conflict among gods may reflect technological fractures. The war between Horus and Set, between order and chaos, reads like metaphor for competing doctrines, perhaps rival guilds of knowledge from the old world. One preserved proportion, the other embraced power without equilibrium. The eventual triumph of Horus symbolizes restoration, the victory of constraint, of alignment. In every myth, ethics and engineering are the same discipline. Consider the recurring motif of forbidden knowledge. The gods grant humanity tools, then retract or punish misuse. Prometheus chained, Enki scolded, Thoth warned. These are not moral fables alone. They are cultural memories of catastrophic misapplication. The gods are engineers who remember what happens when energy, geometry, or metallurgy exceed the wisdom to wield them. Their commandments are not arbitrary. They are safety protocols surviving apocalypse. The oldest written prayers repeat the demand to restore what was broken. The phrase carved again and again in temple walls may refer not simply to moral decay, but to technical loss. To repair the sky and measure its order, this was the sacred duty entrusted by the gods. When humanity forgot, equilibrium faltered. Floods and fires returned. The legend of divine punishment may thus describe not wrath from above, but consequence from neglect, the entropy that follows disalignment. If the gods were engineers, their departure was pragmatic. They left when their instructions were sufficiently transcribed into monument, myth, and ritual to ensure minimal continuity after they vanished. The ages that followed slowly forgot the context of those instructions, transforming warnings into worship. The gods became untouchable ideals rather than mentors. Civilization shifted from praxis to piety, from experiment to faith, from blueprint to legend. In that transformation lies the tragedy of the ancient world, a curate's loss masquerading as divine mystery. Each temple, each myth, each supposedly miraculous feat of masonry is a page from an instruction manual humanity no longer understands. The gods have not disappeared. Their designs are everywhere, encoded in ratios, alignments, and resonant frequencies. What we call sacred geometry may simply be archaeology, waiting to be recognized as. Stand for a moment in the cool interior of an ancient chamber. The air is heavy, not just with age, but with precision. The walls lean inward at exact harmonic angles. The echo of your breath returns with soft symmetry. You can feel, if you listen closely, the faint hum of ancient engineering, the memory of a world where divinity and technology were one and the same. It is not superstition you feel, but nostalgia. When the gods walked as engineers, they did not seek worship. They sought continuity. Their mythic forms were blueprints of resilience, encoded in symbolism elaborate enough to transcend forgetting. And though their names differ across lands and tongues, they all teach the same principle: that creation without proportion brings ruin, that power without measure breeds collapse. If humanity remembers this once more, we may discover that the gods never left at all. They simply moved into the silence between equations, waiting for us to notice the design they left behind. Every ancient culture remembers the same calamity differently. To Mesopotamia, it was the deluge. To Egypt, the flood that ended the first time. To the Greeks, the drowning of Atlantis. To the Americas, the water that swallowed the sun. The names differ, but the strata agree. Somewhere in the deep memory of the earth, water rose where deserts now stand, and life, civilized, ordered, mathematical life, was swept away. The flood was not myth, it was geology's autopsy of catastrophe. When archaeologists speak of the end of the Ice Age, they mention rising oceans and collapsing glaciers. But they rarely mention the cultural collapse that followed, the erasure of an entire epoch's blueprint. Around 12,800 years ago, meltwater surged from retreating ice sheets, rearranging coastlines faster than memory could adapt. Entire civilizations, if they existed along those fertile coastal plains, would have vanished beneath hundreds of feet of water. Their archives erased, their monuments drowned, leaving only highland echoes for survivors to rebuild from. Imagine a city of stone and light perched along a temperate coastline, its astronomers tracking the precession of the stars, its engineers sculpting monuments to memory. Now, hear the horizon crack. The roar is not thunder, but the sea rising in a fury of planetary correction. Day becomes deluge. Humanity's written codes dissolve into salt. By the next sunrise, only the mountains remember. And those who survive become the seed of myth, their knowledge too advanced to be believed by their own descendants. In the geological record, we find witness. Layers of alluvial clay deposit where they do not belong, ancient riverbeds suddenly overlaid by marine sediment. Microfossils of plankton are discovered embedded in inland rock. The Sea of Marmara, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean all show signs of abrupt refilling around the same epoch. The earth itself testifies. There was water where there should not be. To call that event coincidence is to refuse the handwriting of the elements. For Egypt, the flood became symbol and scar. The texts refer continually to the time of darkness when the sun was swallowed, when the gods retreated and the balance of Ma'at, the cosmic order, was broken. Even in symbolic retellings, precise astronomical terms appear as if borrowed from scientific logs. The great waters were not merely punishment. They were transition. Civilization ended and something older ended with it, a pattern of alignment between sky and stone. The flood broke not only cities, but continuity. The blueprint theory begins here, that what was lost in that disaster was not material wealth, but design, an understanding of proportion, resonance, and geometry that had once unified humanity's architecture and philosophy. The survivors scattered across rising archipelagos carried fragments of it, recalling its measures as divine instructions. In every rebuilt sanctuary, from Giza's temples to the ziggurats of Ur, we find the same corrections, as if priests were attempting to recreate a lost schematic by memory alone. The oldest king lists make clear that before the historical reigns, epochs of impossibly long duration preceded them. Tens of thousands of years of divine rule compressed into fragmentary symbols. Scholars dismiss those durations as mythic exaggerations, yet the mathematics within them correspond to precessional cycles, the movement of the equinox through the zodiac. Myths, therefore, preserve an astronomical measure of ages. That precision after cataclysm cannot be coincidence. It is memory disguised as religion. Imagine survivors emerging from the flood's retreat, finding only fragments of the old world intact. The great monuments partly submerged, the writing washed away, the machines dissolved. For a generation or two, they tried to recall the formulas, the sacred ratios, the frequencies that harmonize stone and sky. Their builders' guild becomes priesthood, their engineering texts become scripture, and where knowledge fails, allegory fills the void. The result is not fabrication, but translation across extinction. The evidence of sudden water destruction appears even where we least expect it. The Sphinx enclosure shows rainfall erosion incompatible with the surrounding desert. Further east, megalithic sites exhibit sediment layers inconsistent with normal aging. Shells and corals cling to mountain crevices now far above sea level. When the flood came, it rewrote geography, converting one era's coast into another's desert. Those displaced carried with them the architecture of adaptation. What they rebuilt inland was not new civilization, but survival architecture, memory made durable against repetition. Nearly every holy text remembers the flood as moral judgment, but the scale of the deluge itself suggests something impersonal, mechanical, atmospheric. It was Earth's reset function performed without malice, following the cold equations of orbital mechanics. Perhaps the planet itself keeps time by catastrophe. Every few tens of millennia, chaos sweeps away accumulation, leaving a few survivors to start again with relics and whispers. The flood then ceases to be mythic. It becomes systemic. In the myths that follow the catastrophe, the gods are always gone. Their temples lie underwater, their libraries ash. The surviving humans begin their long apprenticeship anew, guided only by hints left behind. Some stories say the gods promised to return when the stars realigned. Others say they transformed into the constellations above, ensuring their watchers would never forget the original order. In either case, the loss of direct guidance marked the beginning of human civilization proper, the long endeavor to rebuild meaning from ruins. The flood's consequences extend beyond geography. They shaped our psychology. Deep within collective memory lingers an inherited anxiety, the fear that everything sturdy is temporary. We build monuments to outlive disaster, yet beneath that ambition lies remembrance of drowning. Why does every ancient culture construct artificial mountains, ziggurats, pyramids, towers? Because somewhere in our genetic record, high ground equals survival. Architecture itself may be a form of trauma response, engineering therapy on a planetary scale. The legend of the Ark, repeated in countless forms, encapsulates humanity's obsession with preservation after annihilation. The vessel is not invention. It is replication of an older pattern, the vault, the container, the temple. Within its walls, blueprints are stored, not merely for life, but for the principles that sustain life. The flood narrative becomes a parable for information preservation. Each culture builds its ark, literal or symbolic, to ferry memory across extinction's sea. When we read ancient myths as engineering aftermath, their details shift meaning. The dove released to find land becomes the reconstruction of measurement, the rediscovery of solid foundation. The rainbow of covenant is hydrographical. Sunlight refracted through atmospheric change, announcing stability restored. The flood's end marks not redemption, but recalibration. The survivors rebuild, driven by obsessive accuracy. Their descendants become architects obsessed with aligning temples to heaven, a pathological repetition of the desire to remember lost equilibrium. In some traditions, the flood ends not with salvation, but silence. The gods depart entirely, leaving behind tools and imprints in stone. Humanity mistakes absence for transcendence and calls it divinity. But absence can also be design. Perhaps the gods, or ancestors by any other name, intended disappearance as provocation, to compel remembering rather than obedience, to force civilization to reconstruct the lost blueprint on its own, line by weary line. Modern hints at the same wound. Genetic bottlenecks correspond roughly to the time of catastrophic environmental disruption. The human population nearly vanished once, reduced to scattered tribes. From that near extinction arose memory transmuted into myth. We descend not from the inventors of civilization, but from its custodians, the ones who carried fragments over mountains, who remembered how to measure even as they forgot what those measurements meant. Civilized memory is, in essence, salvage. The flood's legacy can be traced in the architectural obsession of the ancient world. Every pyramid, every step temple, every ziggurat is built not only to honor the sky, but to guard against the sea. They mark the vertical defiance of water, the human insistence on stability in an unstable world. The builders encoded hydrological awareness into their design. The slope angles, drainage passages, and elevation ratios are not random. They are prophylactic. Earth will flood again, and the monuments wait as if for a rehearsal. Consider the possibility that the flood served another, subtler purpose: the selective preservation of knowledge. Destroys but also curates. When civilization falls into the ocean, its ideas sink with it. But the survivors who endure are those who valued transmission over possession. Their oral traditions, mythic frameworks, and sacred rituals carry infra-language, patterns that store mathematical or astronomical truth without writing. Myth survives paper. And through myth, truth reincarnates. Standing atop a modern shore, you might feel the same unease the ancients felt. Wind heavy with salt, horizon trembling with light. Beneath those waters perhaps lie entire continents of ruin. Each wave repeats the same syllable. Remember, the sea does not bury, it bookmarks. Geology is not history's grave, it is its index. And someday, as ice melts and levels rise, the next civilization will find our monuments beneath new oceans and call us mythical too. The flood that erased the blueprint was not failure, it was transition. What was lost physically was preserved symbolically, encoded in scars, stories, and numbers. The songs, ratios, and patterns left behind are the breadcrumbs leading back to the origins of human design. To follow them is not to seek fantasy but continuity, to accept that civilization is not a singular ascent, but an endless act of reconstruction after drowning. The question is not whether the flood happened. The question is whether we have yet learned to carry our blueprints high enough above the waterline. After the waters withdrew, the world was not born anew. It was reborn in fragments. Civilization rose again not as invention, but as salvage. The survivors who scattered across the fertile plains of Mesopotamia and along the rejuvenated banks of the Nile were not beginners. They were rememberers, compelled by an inexplicable nostalgia for something they could no longer name. What they built were not experiments but echoes of a world burned, drowned, and half forgotten. Sumer and Kemet, Mesopotamia and Egypt are twin mirrors reflecting this act of rebuilding. Both appear in history already formed, already fluent in writing, law, and measure. Their temples mirror older geometries. Their pantheons share the same post-catastrophic vocabulary: restoration, renewal, resurrection. They are civilizations of aftermath, and everything they created bears the invisible watermark of survival. Their myths are manuals of reconstruction masked as religion. Imagine the first city rising from the marshes of southern Mesopotamia. The air still carries the bitterness of salt from vanished seas. On the horizon, reeds move like a second language. Scribes press styluses into wet clay, recording quantities of grain and cycles of the moon, unaware that they are resurrecting the first database of Earth. Each tablet they bake is an ember of memory made durable, a small defiance of oblivion. In those marks lies continuity, the accountant as priest, the warehouse as temple, the seal as charm against forgetting. In Egypt, the Nile's flood becomes the calendar itself. Each inundation is not merely agricultural but spiritual, a miniature echo of the great flood that once ended the world. The receding water reveals life out of destruction. Priests declare that the river is a god reborn yearly, and its rhythm is engineered into their monuments. Every pyramid, every colonnade stands as a technology of balance, designed to remind the people that the universe, though wounded, still cycles toward restoration. Rebuilding is an act of archaeology lived forward. The architects of Sumer and Kemet seemed obsessed not simply with creating, but with aligning, with recovering lost proportions. Their ziggurats and pyramids are translations of the same impulse, vertical bridges between worlds. The ziggurat steps mimic ascension through elements: earth, air, fire, and heaven. The pyramid's smooth sides channel sunlight into eternity. One form externalizes scale, the other internalizes it. Both recreate a geometry older than their soil, both built by peoples haunted by architectures they could not fully recall. The myths reveal their orientation. In Sumer, the god Enki restores order after the flood by teaching building, measurement, and song. In Egypt, Ptah speaks the world back into precision through thought and speech. Both are deities of craft, of engineering spirituality, of renewal through articulation. Their followers, always, are builders. Cities rise where the divine voice once sounded, not as monuments to power, but as therapy for loss. Civilization is the treatment for cosmic amnesia. The parallels between Sumer and Kemet extend beyond myth into mathematics and governance. Both adopt sexagesimal division, the 60-fold measure of time and space. Both treat the sky as archive and oracle, measuring the cycles of Venus and Sirius to regulate agriculture and ritual. Their administrative records adopt a tone of reverent bureaucracy, treating quantity itself as evidence of divine presence. A census is not control but sacred remembrance. Every tally connects heaven to harvest, as if counting were prayer. Yet beneath that precision burns the memory of fire. Sumerian legends recall a time when the bright weapon fell from the heavens, when storm and flame devoured the cities. Egypt's texts speak of Ra's eye burning the world for human arrogance. Across both cultures, fire follows flood, a cycle of destruction by water, then light. Some interpret this as metaphor for spiritual cleansing, but the geological signature of that era, impact glass, melted sand, global soot, tells another story. The Earth records trauma as efficiently as myth. To imagine the world immediately after such cataclysm is to understand the psychology of Sumer and Kemet. They built not from ambition, but from anxiety. Their walls are prayers for continuity. Their laws are protections against chaos. The obsession with order, the endless accounting, weighing, aligning, stems from the terror of recurrence. Each brick laid atop another was an attempt to trap stability itself, to anchor time. Their temples are strategies against entropy, their rituals the maintenance scripts of survival. In this sense, the gods they worshipped were not lords but supervisors of reconstruction. Enlil measured the heavens, Thoth audited eternity. Their divine councils resembled technical committees, each god responsible for an aspect of recovery: irrigation, metallurgy, star mapping. In the relics of both cultures, one feels an uneasy professionalism, a memory of obligation rather than devotion. Humanity, it seems, was assigned a task after the flood, to remember enough to rebuild, but not enough to cause another conflagration. Compare the imagery of the two creation epics. In Sumer, humans are fashioned from clay mixed with the blood of divinity, a fusion of material and memory. In Egypt, humanity is molded on a potter's wheel by Khnum, whose hands shape the fragility of clay into living archive. The metaphor is transparency itself. To be human is to be remade from remnants. The body becomes the tablet, the soul, the inscription of the age before forgetting. As both civilizations stabilize, they begin to replicate the layout of the cosmos in urban form. In Sumer, the city grid reflects celestial maps, each temple aligned to its patron star. In Egypt, the temples model the journey of the sun through the underworld, corridors simulating cosmic time. Architecture becomes theology you can walk through. The experience of the city is ritual, each street a chant, each chamber a verse of cosmic restoration. To live within these geometries was to inhabit regained order. Trade routes form like neural networks between these centers of recovery. Clay tablets travel up the Euphrates, papyrus scrolls down the Nile. Knowledge circulates, mutates, fuses. Myths crossbreed, absorbing shared trauma into coherent cosmology. The flood becomes a point of origin, but also a warning, the archetypal memory that forever binds technical mastery to ethical caution. Society's birth certificate is signed in water and sealed in fire. Even their language betrays this duality. In Sumerian, the word for heaven doubles as measure. In Egyptian, The symbol for truth is a plumb line. Moral order and structural order are synonymous. To sin is to misalign, to fall out of proportion with the cosmos. The architecture of morality and the morality of architecture intertwine. Every beam and boundary defines not power, but harmony. Their civilizations flourish because they remember what the flood erased, that survival depends on symmetrical conduct. But the memory of fire lingers. In both traditions, the gods withdraw gradually, leaving administrations and priests in their stead. Bureaucracy replaces direct contact. What was once the sacred art of restoration becomes routine, codified, inert. The divine engineers become myths of origin. Their warnings fade into ornament. Civilization forgets again that its gods were not creators, but curators, not omnipotent, but responsible. Forgetting breeds pride, and pride invites repetition. From the mud of Sumer rise towers of ambition that seek heaven, not harmony. From the dust of Egypt, pyramids grow empty, their builders unaware that what they mimic was never meant to glorify rulers, but to balance worlds. The memory of the flood becomes fairy tale. The memory of fire becomes only allegory. Humanity resumes its familiar role, inheriting without comprehension, replicating without reverence. Yet traces persist. The star alignments, the modular mathematics, the precision of cardinal orientation. These are the fingerprints of remembrance that endure long after language decays. Every subsequent civilization, knowingly or not, borrows from the same recovered draft. The Greeks inherit ratios, the Hebrews moral symmetry, the Islamic world sacred geometry. All descend, ultimately, from two lands that refuse to accept extinction. Sumer and Kemet were less the start of history than the restoration of it. Walk now in imagination through the ruins of Ur at twilight or Giza at dawn. The air murmurs with equations turned to dust. Each column, each ziggurat edge, vibrates with hierarchy disguised as humility. The builders speak through silence, through alignment, through the unbroken relationship between shadow and sun. They do not claim authorship, they claim memory. What they restored we call origin. To call them rebuilders is to recognize that civilization's first act was not creation, but remembrance. The flood and the fire had baptized the earth, and what emerged was not naive, but disciplined. Humanity's oldest cities rise from salvage operations older than their myths. And if their geometry still commands awe, it is because it encodes a truth so simple we forget it between catastrophes. That survival is architecture. Memory needs monuments as lungs need air. The rebuilders knew this and built accordingly. If history were a river, its course would be expected to flow smoothly from source to mouth. Yet what we call chronology feels more like a delta, where separate currents split, overlap, and vanish beneath mist. When examined closely, the world's timelines, archaeological, linguistic, genetic, astronomical, refuse to converge neatly. The further we dig, the more evident it becomes that humanity's past is not a line, but a braided network, knotted and uprooted by flood and amnesia. Civilization's rise in Sumer and Egypt is presented as coincidence, an evolutionary inevitability. But coincidence collapses under the weight of parallel precision. Both cultures emerge suddenly with fully formed writing systems, complex mathematics, astronomical awareness, and interlocking pantheons of restoration. Their ages are set by pottery fragments, radiocarbon approximations, and bureaucratic confidence. Yet each recalculation of carbon, each translation of script, produces a new disagreement. the calendars of progress drift apart like continents. Archaeology insists on the certainty of strata. One layer equals one era, but the Earth resists human simplification. Geological upheaval, reuse of stone, and catastrophic deposition distort the elegant order of textbooks. Temples built atop older foundations merge eras into composite fossils of time. A single column might belong to three civilizations at once, quarried in one age, engraved in another, restored in a third. The monument endures, but the memory of its sequence decays. Time itself becomes recombinant. Compare the ancient timelines of Egypt and Mesopotamia side by side, and the dissonance is clear. The Egyptian Old Kingdom is dated thousands of years after Sumer's earliest cities. Yet both display knowledge apparently inherited, not developed. Proto-cuneiform and hieroglyphic scripts bloom simultaneously, fully standardized as though translated from a common source. The statistical likelihood of two civilizations inventing bureaucratic salinity at the same historical moment is infinitesimal. It is more plausible that both were reconstructing the same lost record. The gaps widen when we add other disciplines. Astronomy maps sky alignments that correspond not to their supposed building dates, but to epochs thousands of years earlier. Linguistics traces isolated terms, words for stars, metals, measures that appear identically in languages separated by oceans. Genetics reveals population bottlenecks inconsistent with gradual cultural transmission. Three sciences, each speaking independently, repeat the same sentence. Something is missing between the lines of history. Modern chronology depends on counting from what can be verified: dynasties, treaties, inscriptions. But absence also communicates. What is not written may be louder than what is. The voids between civilizations pulse with unexplained knowledge transfer. Who taught the Sumerians to divide a circle into 360 degrees? Who taught Egyptians to align structures with polar drift? The oldest evidence appears without adolescence, bearing the confidence of systems matured in another age. Imagine if the tidy staircase of human progress were merely stacked fragments of multiple, forgotten civilizations. Each time cataclysm reset the planet, survivors resumed construction, inheriting vestiges, mathematical constants, myths of proportion, vague cosmological blueprints. Later, archaeologists mistook these phases for evolution. In truth, they might represent recursion, humanity rebuilding the same society at different altitudes of memory. The pattern once seen cannot be unseen. Chronological disjunction is not confined to the ancient world. Even recorded history carries distortions. Empires counted years by their rulers' reigns, altering calendars with each succession. Conquests erased archives. Entire centuries compress or expand depending on method of dating. What we think of as distinct epochs might have overlapped, shadowing each other across regions isolated by translation error or deliberate revision. History's arithmetic is fragile. A misplaced decade can distort the shape of civilization. Egypt and Mesopotamia are only the loudest examples of this dissonance. Elsewhere, India's Indus Valley civilization exhibits advanced urban planning, contemporaneous with Egypt's Old Kingdom, yet with no traceable connection despite architectural kinship. South American constructions mirror Old World precision stonework long before supposed transoceanic contact. Chronologists explain these with isolationist coincidence, but stone geometry tells another tale. It remembers ratios older than continents. Every adjustment historians make to maintain the accepted timeline requires additional complexity. New intermediate cultures, hypothetical precursors, evolutionary expansions of periodization, each patch creates further dissonance. The mosaic grows intricate but less truthful. The more scholars refine the chronological scaffolding, the further the structure drifts from the evidence that birthed it. Eventually, the framework becomes self-sustaining, protecting reputation rather than revelation. Consider the recurring phrase, "once thought to be older." It appears in nearly every archaeological report. Artifacts repeatedly surface that challenge dating frameworks, only to be reclassified rather than integrated. The intellectual reflex prefers preservation of consistency over acceptance of chaos. But truth, like geological pressure, eventually fractures containment. When dates from unrelated fields, astronomy, stratigraphy, genetics, begin to harmonize out of sync with narrative order, the discrepancy itself becomes data. The discord is the clue. Linguistics amplifies this rift. Many ancient tongues emerge suddenly with complete grammatical systems, not as crude pidgins, but as refined expressions of abstraction. The Sumerian isolate, for instance, has no linguistic ancestors identified. Egyptian hieroglyphs appear mature, visually codified as though transcribed from earlier, vanished scripts. If languages preserve cognition's lineage, then their abrupt maturity implies translation, not invention. Humanity might have lost not its voice but the script where that voice originated. Astronomy, in turn, functions as time's audit. The precessional alignments encoded in pyramids, stone circles, and Mayan observatories correspond to skies that existed far earlier than assigned chronologies. Such alignment demands observation across millennia, implying institutional memory or inherited data. When the stars themselves contradict textbooks, the stars win because they lie less. The heavens are the only archive immune to propaganda. These collisions across disciplines lead toward a disturbing implication: that civilizations we know as ancient might be restorations of others equally advanced, erased by catastrophe and reformulated from residual knowledge. Each time the world reawakens, it starts mid-conversation, assuming continuity where there is none. The broken lines of time masquerade as coherence. History, therefore, may be not an ascent, but a repeating fever dream, lucid only in fragments before amnesia resets the sequence. Chronology resists reconciliation because it may be built atop partial recovery of circular time. The precession of equinoxes, the cycles of sunspot decades, the slow oscillations of Earth's orbital eccentricity, all produce rhythms much longer than cultural memory can grasp. What we interpret as isolated dawns of civilization could be re-emergences aligned with those cosmic cycles. As the sky reset, so did culture. Astronomy and archaeology mirror each other, both reconstructing pattern from erasure. Imagine unfolding human history like layers of sediment. Beneath the visible layers of Egypt and Sumer lies an older stratum, the lost societies of the late Ice Age. Beneath them, perhaps deeper still, other epochs of intelligence drowned and unrecorded. Our entire timeline might represent one small exposure of an ongoing cycle. Catastrophe covers, fire renews, memory incubates. Then, as waters retreat or stars realign, new builders appear, calling themselves first, unaware they are ninth or 10th. The refusal of chronologies to meet is less an error than a fingerprint. It signals that our conception of time's flow is incomplete. If history replays under different constellations, if the same alignments breed the same architectures, then age itself becomes relative. The Great Pyramid, the ziggurat, the stone circle, they may be additions, not originals. Humanity may not ascend history. It edits it, rewriting from the remnants each time the manuscript burns. What then does this mean for identity? If we are restorers rather than originators, our greatness lies not in creation, but in recollection. Progress becomes remembrance performed at ever higher frequencies, a fugue of rediscovery. Perhaps this is why modern, with all its rigor, still dreams of paradise lost, of golden ages. Deep down, we suspect that knowledge is returning, not emerging. The tools we invent echo functions we once used instinctively before the world went dark. Every age rebuilds its calendar by its own pride. We number our years from emperors, messiahs, revolutions. Yet the stars mark ages on scales indifferent to politics. If time itself operates in cycles of erosion and return, our chronologies will never meet because they were never meant to. They were designed as localized coordinates within an orbiting narrative. The failure to align is not confusion. It is the evidence of recurrence. The implications are unsettling. It would mean that history's apparent complexity is camouflage for simplicity. The same drama replayed across geological epochs. Civilizations arise, perfect geometry, reach hubris, perish, and forget. The survivors rebuild, convinced they are pioneers. The record grows thick with coincidence only because repetition has replaced invention. The pattern's persistence hints at guidance, whether human or cosmic, intentional or statistical. The effect is indistinguishable from fate. To resolve these discordant chronologies would require an honesty alien to our institutions, to accept that progress is circular, that invention is recollection, that humanity's earliest teachers may have been its own ancestors reborn. Without that humility, each generation will continue to call itself the beginning, carving new calendars atop the same scarred stone. The river of time may appear linear to the traveller within it, but from above, it is a spiral, a current bending back toward origins we insist on calling the future. It begins with silence, the kind of silence that is not absence but condensation, the pause before memory returns. Beneath every ruin and inscription, beneath the erosion of temple walls, and under the sands that swallowed Giza, something remains awake. The ancient world did not build to dazzle the future. It built to speak to a listener it could not see, perhaps us. The idea that civilization is not invention but remembrance transforms every monument into an act of reaching backward. The ancients spoke through geometry and proportion, convinced that one day someone would decipher their language again. They forecast forgetfulness, and they built against it. Each pyramid, ziggurat, and standing stone becomes less a celebration of power and more a monument to communication, letters to posterity written in miles and shadow. Now, thousands of years later, we are the recipients of that correspondence. The lines of their architecture whisper equations we barely rediscovered. Their myths encode the timelines we lost. What we once called progress may instead be translation, the rephrasing of an older text. Humanity is not evolving away from its origin, it is orbiting it, spiraling through cycles of forgetting and awakening. Imagine a civilization that lived through multiple endings, flood, fire, famine, and understood that each epoch births the next through loss. Its engineers would no longer build for comfort, but for continuity. They would design to outlast their own extinction. They would be indistinguishable from faith, their monuments indistinguishable from memory devices. This was Egypt. This was Sumer. This was the civilization that remembered us before we existed. Their builders knew that knowledge is fragile, so they encoded it into matter itself. A stone cannot burn, a ratio cannot rust. They learned the grammar of permanence and hid their mathematics inside beauty. The golden ratio, the number 72, the cycle of the great year, all drift unnoticed in our modern sciences, echoes of a lexicon older than mapping itself. They did not predict the future, they prepared for recovery. This is why the ancients wrote little about themselves. They were not obsessed with biography or chronology. Their obsession was resonance, transferring principle rather than story, symmetry instead of anecdote. They built mechanisms of remembrance, not museums of nostalgia. The difference is subtle but essential. They wanted us not merely to know they existed, but to know what they had known. If you study their cities carefully, you see this intent. The orientation of Giza to the cardinal points, the mirrored axes of Luxor, the gridwork of Ur, all are records in architectural phase. The builders left algorithms inscribed not in words, but in alignments. Even as rulers changed and scribes reinterpreted myths, these structures persisted as silent equations describing time, light, and distance. They survived translation because they were written in the only universal language, proportion. Modern scientists now measure with lasers what their ancestors measured with stars, finding the same result. The speed of light, planetary ratios, and harmonics appear encoded into stone placements. We find this unsettling because history has trained us to expect progression, not recursion. Yet here is evidence that the past anticipated our rediscoveries. The civilization that remembered us left reminders, not miracles, just patient geometry waiting for consciousness to return. Their warnings were equally intentional. Ancient texts describe cycles of catastrophe born from imbalance, of pride, of disregard for cosmic proportion. Those were not superstitions, but physics, written as parable. When Sumerians spoke of the gods departing, they meant harmony lost. When Egyptians insisted on maintaining Ma'at, they meant equilibrium with planetary and moral forces. Their theology disguised thermodynamics. Their morality masked mechanics. The civilization that remembered us saw time differently. To them, death was not end, but rotation. Extinction, not tragedy, but reset. They did not fear apocalypse. They designed for it. Their entire world operated as a redundancy network for continuity, storing essential data in mythological encryption. By deifying memory, they ensured that even forgetting could not erase foundation. They encoded warning and wisdom alike in symbols meant to trigger recognition whenever language evolved enough to understand again. This is why their silence feels alive. The unfinished obelisks, the scaled tunnels beneath pyramids, the inexhaustible recurrence of the same ratios. These are mid-sentences, fragments of a larger dialogue between epochs. To engage with them is to realize we were expected. Their work presupposes rediscovery. Their architecture anticipates question. They built not for praise but for conversation across millennia. It is tempting to think that we are nearing the end of that cycle. Technology now extends deeper and higher than myth dared imagine. Satellites trace the same celestial geometries the ancients mapped by eye. Digital archives mirror their engraved tablets. But our acceleration carries the same risk their myths warned against, the arrogance to assume invention rather than recovery. The civilization that remembered us designed for memory. We design for replacement. That distinction may prove fatal. What they understood, and what we are beginning to relearn, is that endurance requires reverence. They treated and number as interchangeable because to mistreat one was to disturb the other. When fields overflourished or rivers shifted, they saw loss of balance, not accident. Knowledge without humility, they believed, invited another flood, not necessarily of water, but of forgetting. Every disaster begins as a deficit of remembrance. Imagine standing once again before the Great Pyramid at twilight. The air vibrates faintly with desert heat, and feel the resonance within the stone. The geometry is not decorative, it is mnemonic. The sides taper to mirror the angle of sunlight at solstice. The proportions express pi, that endless fraction tying circle to line. In this structure is patience, the same patience of its builders, who trusted that one day someone would understand. And here you stand, centuries later, fulfilling their equation by noticing. The implication is profound. Memory is mutual. We remember them as they remembered us. Civilization is not merely cumulative knowledge, but reciprocal calling, each age decoding and reenacting the message of the one that came before. In this view, history becomes a feedback system between mortals and monuments, across eras separated by void, but joined by geometry. To participate in remembrance is to restore connection, to complete a circuit spanning thousands of years. The more we rediscover their codes, the more silence recedes. Ancient alignments begin to make sense as measurements of equinox drift. Their myths of the first time resolve into climate data. What we once dismissed as metaphor becomes manual. The gods walking as engineers, the floods recording temperature shifts, the pyramids aligning with stellar changes. Each myth regains factual skeleton. The legend is not false, it is formatted in another medium. This recognition forces humility. For centuries, modernity positioned itself as culmination, as if the arrow of time were ours alone. But beneath every scientific triumph lies déjà vu. The ancients were not ignorant dreamers. They were archivists of recurrence, engineers of survival. They built with eternity in mind because they had already endured eternity once. We, by contrast, build for economy, not endurance, mistaking efficiency for evolution. It is easy to romanticize them, but perhaps they were simply pragmatic about mortality. Generations fade, stone remembers. They measured permanence not in lifespan, but in pattern. Their question was not who built, but who would hear. In that question lies the distinction between empire and civilization. Empire seeks permanence of dominance. Civilization seeks permanence of meaning. The first collapses quickly. The second, given enough time, resurrects itself. All across the world, the same act repeats. Forgotten patterns reappear, myth aligns with matter, and modernity encounters its mirror in antiquity. We dig to find origin, but the earth yields reflection. The spiral turns again, and we realize that we are not the beginning, but the continuation of a message older than timekeeping. The civilization that remembered us did not vanish. We are its delayed echo, repeating its gesture, building, naming, measuring, without knowing why. So what remains is the final inheritance, responsibility. To remember that knowledge can die as easily as language, that balance demands guardianship, that memory requires architecture. The ancients built for us. Now we build for whoever listens next. Perhaps they too will decipher our structures, misunderstanding our words but recognizing our intentions. And as we deciphered theirs, they will feel the same astonishment, the same realization that time is not a path, but a mirror. In that mirror, the past and future gaze at each other, neither claiming primacy, both serving memory. This is the revelation left inside every monument, every line of proportion, every silence too precise to be accident. Civilization endures only as reflection, and remembrance is its only immortality. Somewhere beyond the horizon of catastrophe, the cycle will turn again. And when it does, the civilization that remembered us will awaken once more, this time bearing our name.
If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.